What if the document format you trust is actually a trap? Every time you open a .docs file, you're using Office Open XML, a format that now powers hundreds of millions of documents worldwide. And right now, LibreOffice is accusing Microsoft of something explosive, deliberately engineering these file formats to be so complex that they function as digital handcuffs. This isn't speculation. This is about the format behind every Word document and Excel spreadsheet you've ever created. And what the Document Foundation discovered was far more calculated than anyone expected. In July 2025, LibreOffice published a scathing accusation. Microsoft, they claimed, intentionally makes its Office file formats unnecessarily complex to achieve vendor lock-in. The goal? Make it nearly impossible for competitors to properly support Microsoft documents, forcing users to stay trapped in the Microsoft ecosystem. And in February 2026, they doubled down with an even stronger statement. Microsoft prioritizes its own commercial interests over everything, including scientific accuracy. Let's talk about what Microsoft says Office Open XML does. Microsoft introduced Office Open XML, or OOXML, as the default file format for Word, Excel, and PowerPoint in 2007 with Office 2007. The formats replaced the old binary formats. .doc became .docs, .xls became .xlsx, .ppt became .pptx. Microsoft positioned OOXML as a modern, open XML-based standard that would ensure document compatibility across platforms and preserve data for decades. In 2008, after a highly controversial process, OOXML was approved as an international standard by ISO and IEC, designated as ISO/IEC 29500. Microsoft marketed this heavily. They claimed OOXML was transparent, well-documented, and open for anyone to implement. The company argued that the XML structure made documents machine-readable, future-proof, and interoperable. On paper, any software developer could read the specification and build applications that perfectly handle Microsoft documents. The format works by storing documents as zipped collections of XML files. When you open a .docx file, you're actually opening a zip archive containing multiple XML files that define the document structure, formatting, content, and metadata. Microsoft said this approach was clean, modern, and accessible. They promised that competitors, governments, and institutions could trust OOXML as a genuine open standard. But security researchers, open source developers, and standardization experts found something very different when they looked under the hood. LibreOffice, backed by the Document Foundation, spent years analyzing OOXML implementation. What they discovered wasn't a clean, interoperable standard. It was, in their words, an artificially complex schema designed to create barriers rather than bridges. The core issue is how Microsoft structures the XML. LibreOffice identified several deliberate complexity factors. First, deeply nested tag structures with excessive abstraction. Simple formatting that should require a few lines of code instead requires navigating maze-like hierarchies. Second, dozens or even hundreds of optional or overloaded elements. The specification includes so many conditional paths that implementing full support becomes a nightmare for any developer not intimately familiar with Microsoft's internal systems. Third, non-intuitive naming conventions. Elements are named in ways that only make sense if you've worked on Microsoft Office codebases for years. Fourth, widespread use of extension points and wildcards, allowing Microsoft to add proprietary features that aren't fully documented. Fifth, multiple imports of namespaces and complex type hierarchies that create dependencies on Windows-specific behaviors. LibreOffice used a railway analogy to explain the lock-in strategy. Imagine a public railway system where the tracks are accessible to everyone. But the main train manufacturer imposes an incredibly complicated control system. In theory, anyone could build a train compatible with the tracks. But the control system specifications are so convoluted that only the main manufacturer can ultimately offer rail service. Passengers don't realize they're being held hostage by technical constraints they can't understand until ticket prices rise or service quality declines. At that point, the manufacturer can dictate its terms, and passengers are forced to accept them. The real-world test results back this up. When LibreOffice or other Office suites try to open complex Microsoft documents, they often encounter rendering issues, tables that shift, formatting that breaks, fonts that change. Microsoft Office handles these documents perfectly because the software was built in tandem with the format. But for competitors, even with access to the open specification, achieving perfect compatibility is nearly impossible. Here's where you might think, well, if it's an ISO standard, it must be properly documented. That's the problem. Microsoft Office doesn't actually use the ISO standard version in practice. The ISO standard defines two variants, strict and transitional. The strict variant is supposed to be the clean, modern standard. The transitional variant includes legacy features for backward compatibility with old binary formats. Microsoft Office 2013 and later versions can read and write the strict variant. But here's the catch, the default format is still transitional. Unless users manually change their settings, every document they create uses the transitional variant, which includes undocumented legacy behaviors, Windows-specific dependencies, and binary data structures that contradict the transparency XML is supposed to provide. LibreOffice can't fully implement these undocumented behaviors because Microsoft never properly specified them. The standardization process itself was controversial. In 2007, ISO initially rejected OOXML. Because members argued it was unnecessary, Open Document Format, or ODF, already existed as an international standard and was less complex. But Microsoft pushed OOXML through a fast-track process. Countries reported unusual pressure to vote in favor. Norway's standards body changed its vote from disapproval to approval, despite the majority of its technical committee opposing the standard. After OOXML was ratified, 13 committee members resigned in protest. The European Union's Open Source Observatory reported on criticisms of the process. IBM and Red Hat stated that ISO was losing credibility. Ubuntu founder Mark Shuttleworth commented that his organization wouldn't invest in implementing a poorly defined standard. The entire process revealed how a dominant corporation can manipulate standardization bodies to rubber stamp a format that serves its commercial interests rather than genuine interoperability. Now let's talk about real-world harm. In August 2020, the Human Genome Organization's Gene Nomenclature Committee made an extraordinary announcement. They were renaming human genes because of Microsoft Excel. For years, Excel had been silently corrupting genetic data in research papers. Gene names like SEPT2 and MARCH1 were automatically converted to dates, September 2nd and March 1st. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was contaminating scientific databases and compromising research into genetic diseases. A 2016 study found that approximately 20% of genomics papers published in 18 major journals contained Excel files with gene name errors. In 2021, researchers scanned over 11,000 papers published between 2014 and 2020. They found gene name errors in 30.9% of articles with supplementary Excel gene lists, higher than the 2016 estimate, meaning the problem was getting worse, not better. Journals like Nature Communications, PLOS One, and Scientific Reports published hundreds of affected papers each. The scientific community tried everything. They published warnings, created YouTube tutorials, developed software tools to escape data before importing it into Excel. Nothing worked at scale because the default behavior remained unchanged. Finally, geneticists gave up and renamed genes to avoid Excel's autocorrect. SEPT2 became SEPTIN2. MARCH1 became MARCHF1. DEC1 became DELEC1. The names of elements in our genome were permanently changed, not because the science required it, but because Microsoft refused to fix a known bug that had been documented for over 15 years. Italo Vignoli, a founding member of the Document Foundation, called this out directly in February 2026. He wrote that Microsoft's refusal to fix Excel's gene name corruption illustrates how willing the company is to overlook everything for its own commercial interests. Scientific accuracy, research integrity, patient outcomes, and genetic disease treatment, all secondary to preserving Excel's default behaviors and maintaining compatibility with decades of legacy. Spreadsheets. Consider what this means in practice. Imagine a medical researcher analyzing patient genomic data to identify markers for a rare disease. Their Excel file silently corrupts gene names in their dataset. The corrupted data gets published. Another research team tries to replicate the findings using the supplementary data. Critical genes are missing or mangled. The replication fails. Months or years are wasted. Clinical trials based on that research might be delayed or derailed. The consequences ripple through the entire scientific pipeline. Or imagine a journalist working on a sensitive investigation involving confidential documents shared as .docx files. They open those files in LibreOffice because they prefer open source software. But because Microsoft's format is so complex and includes undocumented behaviors, some embedded metadata or hidden text doesn't render correctly in LibreOffice. The journalist misses critical information, or worse, accidentally publishes redacted content that wasn't properly removed because the redaction relied on Microsoft-specific formatting that LibreOffice couldn't interpret. Consider a small business or government agency trying to reduce software costs by switching from Microsoft Office to LibreOffice. They have thousands of documents created over decades. When they open those documents in LibreOffice, tables break, macros fail, and complex formatting collapses. The migration becomes so painful that they abandon the effort and renew their Microsoft licenses. That's exactly what vendor lock-in achieves. Microsoft made some changes in response to criticism, but LibreOffice argues they're insufficient. Microsoft Office 2013 added support for reading and writing the strict variant of OOXML, but the default remains transitional. Users would need to manually change settings for every document or create custom templates, steps most users will never take. Microsoft also published additional documentation for some previously undocumented features, but much of the complexity remains embedded in legacy compatibility modes that are impossible for competitors to fully reverse engineer. LibreOffice points out that even with all the documentation, the sheer volume creates barriers. The ISO/IEC 29500 standard specification is over 6,500 pages long. Compare that to Open Document Format, which achieves the same goals in 867 pages. The excessive length isn't necessary for functionality. It's a feature of the complexity strategy. The more convoluted the specification, the harder it is for competitors to implement, and the more likely users will experience compatibility issues that drive them back to Microsoft Office. Microsoft's position has been consistent. They claim OOXML needed to support backward compatibility with billions of existing documents. They argue that the complexity is necessary to preserve formatting, formulas, macros, and features built up over decades. They point out that the format is publicly documented and that anyone can implement it. But critics note that publicly documented doesn't mean practically implementable when the documentation is deliberately convoluted. Here's what you can actually do about this. If you want to reduce your dependence on Microsoft Office and protect your documents from vendor lock-in, first, learn about Open Document Format. ODF is an international standard not controlled by any single company. LibreOffice uses ODF natively. Microsoft Office can also save and open ODF files, though support varies by version. When creating new documents, consider saving them in ODF format. .odt for text documents, .ods for spreadsheets, .odp for presentations. Second, if you need to share documents with Microsoft Office users but want to maintain some independence, save a copy in both formats. Keep the ODF version as your master copy and export to .docx or .xlsx only when necessary for compatibility. Third, evaluate whether LibreOffice or another open source Office suite meets your needs. LibreOffice is free, runs on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, and handles most common Office tasks well. It won't be perfect if you rely heavily on advanced Excel features or complex macros, but for typical document creation, spreadsheets, and presentations, it's a capable alternative. Fourth, support open standards. When governments or organizations issue procurement requirements, advocate for requiring support for open formats like ODF, rather than just accepting proprietary formats as the default. Fifth, if you're a developer or technically inclined, contribute to open source projects like LibreOffice. Report bugs, suggest improvements, or help with documentation. The more robust open source alternatives become, the less power any single vendor has to lock users in. If you're an Excel user working with scientific data, manually format cells as text before entering data that might be auto-converted. Or better yet, use scripting languages like Python or R for data analysis. These tools don't silently corrupt your data and provide better reproducibility and auditability. Sixth, spread awareness. Share information about vendor lock-in with colleagues, friends, and family. Many people don't realize they have choices, or that the file formats they use daily are deliberately designed to restrict those choices. The story of Microsoft Office and OOXML isn't just about software. It's about how a dominant corporation weaponizes technical complexity to maintain market control. It's about how standardization processes can be manipulated. It's about how commercial interest can override scientific accuracy, user freedom, and digital sovereignty. Your documents aren't just files, they're data you should own and control. But when the format itself is a maze designed to keep you dependent on one company's software, you don't really own anything. LibreOffice's accusations aren't just competitive positioning. They're backed by years of analysis, documented compatibility issues, and concrete examples like the XLgene name disaster. Microsoft prioritizes commercial interests over everything. That's not conspiracy, that's business strategy. But it doesn't have to be your strategy. You have alternatives, you have choices, and you have the power to demand better. If this investigation opened your eyes, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into tech industry practices that affect your digital life. Share this video with anyone who uses Microsoft Office, which is probably everyone you know. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Have you experienced compatibility issues with Office documents? Are you willing to try alternatives? Let's keep this conversation going. The next time you save a document, think about what format you're using and why. Your small choices, multiplied across millions of users, can shift the entire industry. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.